Just as soon as corruption sets in, these winged monsters appear, shrieking and croaking and winging their way to death itself. And that indeed is a symbol of civilizations, for they die too, just as well as animal and human life. And whenever a civilization begins to die morally or spiritually, then there begin to appear vultures. And that is the mission of communism in the world. Communism is the scavenger of decaying civilizations. It makes its way into a country and into a culture only when that culture begins to rot from the inside. Measure of the incipient death in any civilization is the progress that communism makes.
Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, for 1 year as we learn from Venerable Fulton Sheen, one of the greatest Catholic teachers in modern times. Join me, Amy Thomas, once a week for a short reading out of Bishop Sheen's book, Way to Inner Peace. Welcome, Catholic pilgrims, to week 11. After that intro from Bishop Fulton Sheen, you're probably a little concerned about what we're going to talk about this week because he says the big C word, communism. Our topic for this week is going to be called Restoring Stolen Goods. And Bishop Sheen is going to tell us the fabulous story about Zacchaeus, how he climbed the sycamore tree. And he was not a well-liked man because he was a tax collector that took more than was his fair share. And, it's very easy to look at rich people and condemn them for taking more than we think they deserve or more than we think they need. There's also a flip side to that. And I think communism and socialism can breed an envy and a jealousy within people who are not wealthy. And they come to believe that they have a right to what is not rightfully theirs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I know that most of us aren't, bank robbers and, thieves of the typical vision that we have in our heads. So I wanted to talk about something that is a hot button topic in our world today and then relate it back to Bishop Sheen's writings. So 3 points to think about as we're reading are restitution, restoration, and honesty. The most interesting tax collector in the history of the world was Zacchaeus, Luke 19, 1-10, if you can call any tax collector interesting. Physically, he was so short that whenever there was a parade, he always had to climb a tree in order to see it. His name meant pure, but he was anything but that, for he was a 25%er, always taking that much at least out of what he collected for his cut. But the end of the story reveals that he was much better than his neighbors believed him to be. This particular day, our blessed Lord came to the village, and Zacchaeus, as was his wont, climbed a sycamore tree. People that want for size must make up for it by sagacity. Not many tax collectors in our days, particularly those who are rich, as was Zacchaeus, would humble themselves by elevating themselves in a tree. But Zacchaeus was rewarded, for our Lord saw him and asked him to take him home. Whenever the Lord wants to give a favor, he often asks for one. When the door was closed behind the two of them, the mob outside was angry, not with the tax collector because he was dishonest, but they were angry with our divine Lord because he ate with disreputable people and sinners. The Savior's way of looking at it was that he had found one sheep that went astray. After a few minutes, the conscience of the tax collector was aroused, for consciences only sleep, they never die. Zacchaeus promised to make amends for his dishonesty by giving half of his goods to the poor and restoring fourfold to anyone whom he had cheated. Restitution is a duty which a civilization that stresses profits and money can readily forget. When anyone has been cheated, when capitalists underpay their workers, when labor leaders during a strike destroy company property, when repairmen pile up needless expenses by the substitution of one item for another of less worth, when an honest day's work is not given for an honest day's pay, there is no distribution of that equilibrium and balance of justice which makes the world livable. Remorse is not enough. Shame is not enough. The balming of dishonesty by saying one has an Oedipus complex or that one feared his grandmother are not enough. There must be a restoring of the property that was stolen. If the person who was cheated cannot be found, there must be a donation of an equal amount to the poor. Restitution is the restoring of a person to that condition from which, contrary to right and duty, we have removed him. The reason for rendering satisfaction for our dishonesty is clear. The law of nature and the law of the land affirm that everyone ought to possess in undisturbed use those goods to which he or she has a right. If we steal something from our neighbor at 9 o'clock at night, it does not rightfully become ours at 10 o'clock. In other words, the passing of time does not change the right, nor make lawful that which was illegal. Under the Levitical law, the Jews were obliged to give 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. Time never cancels out the duty of restoring that which we have unjustly taken from another, regardless of how much sorrow we may have had for the theft. The proof that we are sorry is that we do return the stolen goods. To make money dishonestly and then put it in the wife's name is not to escape the obligation to make restitution. Since such a person never owned the property lawfully, he never could make the transfer legally. Suppose a woman is sold a handkerchief on the pretense that it is silk, when really it is nylon. Restitution must be made. A second-hand car dealer who tells a buyer that the car is in perfect condition and yet knows that he filled the rear transmission with sawdust to hide from 100 miles the defective gears, such a crook is certainly bound to make restitution. There is a story, and it is only a story, about a man who went to confession to a priest. During confession, he stole the priest's watch. He then told the priest that he had stolen a watch. The priest said, "You must make restitution." The thief said, "I'll give it to you, Father." "No," said the priest, "give it to the owner." The penitent said, "The owner won't take it back." "In that case," said the priest, "you can keep it." If this were not a story, the penitent would still be bound to make restitution, not only to the priest from whom he had stolen the watch, but also to God. Honesty is not a policy, it is a duty. So everybody knows that stealing stuff is wrong, even thieves. That's why they typically do it in the cover of night or at gunpoint. Everybody knows that it's wrong. So in this podcast, I'm not going to cover the 7th commandment, thou shalt not steal, talking about the typical don't steal stuff. I want to go a little bit deeper than that. So my degrees lie in the realm of sociology. My undergrad is a BS in sociology, or I emphasized in criminology, and my master's is in applied behavioral science. So basically, I was taught to study criminal behavior. And my junior year of college was when I really started digging into studying people, cultures, economic systems, and criminal behavior. And one of my classes was a full-up study of Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, all those guys. But it was Karl Marx that fascinated me the most, obviously not in a good way, though. And after reading the Communist Manifesto, I was just stunned that anybody, literally anywhere, could think that socialism and communism were a good idea. And this was really the first time I had been introduced to the thought processes behind these ideas. And right away, it was very clear that these ideas were bad news. And when I was in college, there weren't very many people that agreed with Karl Marx. And, this was almost 20 years ago. Well, it was 20 years ago. So, it was very rare to have someone in class who would be championing socialism or communism. But today, that's not the case. And we do see it championed pretty much all over the place. So in high school, I had read Animal Farm, and I didn't quite get the gist of it because I just didn't have a full understanding of socialism. I had this vague idea of the Cold War and that during the Cold War, we were fighting communist Russia. But, just at that time, I didn't have a full grasp of it. And I had read about Joseph McCarthy and his fight to rid America of communists and all of that. And it just wasn't fully sunk into my head yet. I didn't have all the pieces, I guess. But then when I took my class and I really started studying Karl Marx, the light bulb clicked on and, everything kind of fell into place. Now I understood Animal Farm. Now I understood what Joseph McCarthy was trying to do, though he did it wrong sometimes, but I get it. So anyway, while I was in college, we were given scenario after scenario of countries that had tried or were practicing socialism/communism. And I realized there is not a single one I would ever want to live in. They all sounded horrible. And the interesting thing is that even the Pilgrims tried a form of socialism when they first came over, and it absolutely failed. It failed miserably. William Bradford wrote in his Of Plymouth Plantation about how a, quote, share the wealth, spread it around evenly economic system was set up, and it was leading the Pilgrims down the path of starvation. And thankfully, the Pilgrims came to their senses and dropped that practice. And when they did, their situation greatly improved. But initially, the Pilgrims decided that everybody in the colony would get the exact same amount of all the goods that were grown or hunted, no matter what. So if Pilgrim Bob barely tended his garden, but Pilgrim John next door, cultivated his, Pilgrim Bob would get a share of Pilgrim John's hard work. And as you would expect, people just stopped working hard. Because if you don't get to keep what you have worked hard for, you stop being motivated. If you know that you're going to get a share of something, even if you sit on your butt, you're not going to be motivated to do anything. So thankfully, the Pilgrims switched to each person keeping what they worked for. And once that happened, everything righted itself. And so with all the evidence that, socialism and communism never work, it's stunning to me that there is a growing number of people in our country that embrace it, and they full on embrace it. And really, a lot of people aren't even trying to hide it anymore. And in a way, I get it because of how proponents of socialism wrap it up in a pretty box. They wrap it up in a pretty box and they put a big shiny bow on top. It's like you can almost hear the movie guy announcer say, "In a world where everyone is given everything for free and all is fair." Sounds nice until you check into it. So I realize I'm totally bagging on socialism and communism. And I will say that capitalism, if left unchecked, can be damaging. During the industrial age, there was many abuses and a lot of corruption, and it led to greed. And different popes have spoken out about how capitalism can lead to materialism and greed. So, capitalism isn't perfect, and it's not un-American to say that. So it's important that we realize that we have to be able to evaluate ourselves so that we can make sure that we are staying on a just and right path. And we also have to remember that all economic systems are man-made, and therefore they are not perfect. However, obviously there are some that are better, much better than others. And so Pope Leo the 13th, he was back in the late 1800s. He wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, and it spoke out against socialism and the denial of private property. And he said this: to remedy these wrongs, the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state or by municipal bodies. And I don't think I need to go into all that Pope John Paul II had to say about communism. The man lived under communist-occupied Poland. So let's just say he wasn't a fan by any stretch of the imagination. And the Catholic Church has flat out condemned socialism and communism. The church does not condemn capitalism, but it does warn that it has to be practiced with Christian principles at the forefront. Because what you have happen, if it's not, you do have capitalists, the very rich people, taking from, the poorer classes. So it's with socialism and communism, you have governmental systems just taking from everybody and then supposedly splitting it up evenly and fairly amongst everybody. But that's not true, because there's always the leaders at the top that have more than everybody else. But that's the idea, is there's this envy that's brought about in the lower classes for what the rich have. And then the communist swoops in and says, the rich have more than they need. They need to have it taken from them, and then it needs to be distributed fairly between all people so that everything is fair. And so there's a real envy and jealousy that breeds throughout socialism and communism. But capitalism can be the opposite. It can cause the wealthy to grow in their greed and to not pay their workers a just wage, or to abuse workers in order to create more money. And so we have to be careful with any man-made economic system. But going back to what I was talking about, we are now in an age where people are screaming for free college tuition, free healthcare. I need free birth control. I need free everything. But honestly, no earthly good is ever truly free. I mean, that's easy to understand, right? The money to pay for these things has to come from somewhere, and it will always come in the form of taxes. And so, I hear people scream out, just take it from the rich. Now, I agree that the wealthy should be generous with their abundance, but I do not go so far as to say that the state has a right to see them as a cash cow that can just be bled dry for government programs. I also agree that some taxes are necessary for governments, but typically they take it too far, and then they become these ballooned, cumbersome, bureaucratic, ineffective systems that are just trillions of dollars in debt, that do not use the money that they collect in effective and wise ways. They are bad stewards of the money that they take from people. And that is like stealing from people. When you take taxes, if you are not a good steward of them, you are stealing from people. You are taking and wasting it, and then you come up with some new idea, and then you want more money, and so you go and take more money from people, and it's just a mess. It's just a mess. But with socialism, the government moves to deny private property and looks to redistribute wealth around so that all is fair, all is fair. And it's really just a transitional state into communism, where the government then controls everything and people are just a cog in the system. And it is stealing to deny people the fruits of their labor and to take from someone what they have earned through hard work and give it to someone else, even if you think they have more than they need. And the thing is I will always advocate for the wealthy to be generous with their money. And the church will always encourage us to use our surplus, and even then some, to help others. But the thing is that we are best when we do it out of our own free will, not when the government starts doling out what it deems to be fair shares to everyone. When the government forces us to, quote unquote, give our earnings, it robs us of being able to give it to our neighbors out of a desire to help. And contrary to popular belief, most people want to help those that are going through a rough time or need support. So, what does this all have to do with what we read today, with restoring stolen goods? Like I said, we all know that walking into a store and stealing is bad. And I would wager that most people listening to this podcast today are not thieves, where they're going into stores and stealing shoes or clothes or, candy bars or things like that. I mean, if you are struggling with that, obviously go see a priest or a spiritual director. But my guess is that most of you listening to this are not thieves in the typical sense. And so when we look at the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, most of us kind of just wave it off because we're like, I don't do that. I'm not stealing bags of money from banks. I'm not going into department stores and stealing things. So most of us don't think about the seventh commandment too deeply and look at it from a different point of view. And so that's why I wanted to bring up communism and socialism, because there is a growing number of people in our country that are getting on board with these kinds of mindsets, and they really are a way of the government stealing from people. And like I said, they package it up nicely and they make it sound super nice. Everybody will get their fair share, and it doesn't matter what you do, we're going to make sure everyone is taken care of. But that's not right, because we all are entitled to what we work for and what we earn. And no one has the right to come and take it. I understand taxes, but even those go too far. Bishop Sheen says here on page 39, down at the bottom, the reason for rendering satisfaction for our dishonesty is clear. The law of nature and the law of the land affirm that everyone ought to possess in undisturbed use those goods to which he or she has a right. And so this is what I want all of us to think about, is if you are somebody with a surplus and you have been blessed with, an abundance of wealth, we are called to be generous. And we should make sure that, if we own a business or a company, that our practices are moral and ethical, and that we treat those who are under our care, the best that we can. We pay them a just wage, that we treat them with respect and dignity, and that, we're not taking our cut, so to speak. However, those who do own companies and businesses, because of the time and the effort and the money they have invested in it, they do get something for that. They do. I know we think that they should just live off of pennies. I mean, that's how many politicians make us think. But they do get rewarded for starting up a company and building a business that brings about jobs. There should be some reward to that. Otherwise, people would never do it. However, greed must always be in check. We always need to make sure that we're not being greedy. And then if we are not in a higher income bracket, we need to check ourselves, with envy and jealousy. We are not entitled to anybody's money. If they are the wealthiest person in the world, I'm still not entitled to their money. Now, they should be generous and give of it of their own free will, but I am not entitled to go and take it from them. No one really is. And, this is something that we're getting caught up in, is this idea that I'm going to tell you that you have too much and you need to give it to me and others like me. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be in. And it never bodes well. It really doesn't. And so, like I said, I don't think most of us listening to this podcast today are necessarily struggling with the seventh commandment, but I do think there are other ways to look at it. And we need to make sure that our political and economic beliefs are in line with the Catholic Church. If we are Catholic, we cannot go down the road of communism and socialism. It is completely banned. It is a morally corrupt way of running a country. And if we are a capitalist country, we need to be critical of capitalism. We need to keep an eye on it. We need to keep it in check. We need to make sure it's not spilling over into greediness and materialism and the like, the things that the popes have warned us about. Those are all just some really good things to keep in mind. And the last little thing I want to cover with you guys is at the very end of Bishop Sheen's telling of the story of Zacchaeus and Christ coming over to dine at his house. Bishop Sheen says, after a few minutes, the conscience of the tax collector was aroused. And I love this next part. For consciences only sleep. They never die. That is so true. Your conscience never dies. It might just be asleep. And no matter what topic we're talking about, we need to remember that and to keep a healthy, wide awake conscience that is in line with Christ and our Catholic Church and all of the teachings that have been given to us. So that is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. I will see you back here for week 12. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.